Okay, we're going to leap ahead here about, 19 years or so, looking at the 1977 edition of Avalon Hill's Gettysburg. And in this series I'm hoping we're going to see maybe a bit of a game evolution as we look at the games. Now one thing you can notice right away compared to the 58 edition is, a full color box and a much more colorful map. And we'll get to that in a second. Now, by 1977, the wargaming hobby had been well established, and there had been quite an evolution in games. And this title might not be the best title to show as a second one in the series. I did it because it's Gettysburg, and it still is Avalon Hill. But this game is not representative of where the hobby was going at the time. Now, one of the things that Avalon Hill did with this particular version was they included 3 versions of the game in the same box. They had an introductory level game, an intermediate level game, and an advanced game. And I think this was a mistake, as we'll see in a few moments. Now, the introductory level game of Gettysburg was, in my opinion, a complete throwaway game. It was meant to introduce new players to the hobby, but to me it's terrible to introduce new players to the hobby with this thing. It was, in my opinion, a throwaway game, just a complete waste of time. The counters were the worst I'd ever seen. They were too small, they were offset. So I'm not going to say much about the introductory game of Gettysburg. It was a completely throwaway game, no good at all. So let's move on to the intermediate game. Okay, I should say something about the map to Gettysburg. Avalon Hill did something again that the other companies were not doing. At the time, it was fashionable to create a custom map for each game. But what Avalon Hill did was repeat what they had done in 1958. Good and bad to that. They took an actual topographical map of the Battle of Gettysburg, this time based on the 1880s maps of John Batchelder, which were very accurate. So you can see before us we have a nice color map of Gettysburg showing you the terrain and everything. And then what Avalon Hill did was throw a grid on top of it. And they can say, well, didn't that cause all kinds of problems? Well, yes and no, and I'll explain why. What they did was they put a little wee white dot in the center of each hexagon. So, for example, you can see Big Round Top there and Little Round Top. So there was no question when a unit was on Big Round Top. If it was on the center of the square, it was in fact on the hill. So we didn't get into too many arguments about what was a hill and what wasn't with this version of the game. Now, anticipating the problems that could occur, Avalon Hill did include with the rule booklet a small scaled-down version of the map that showed every single hex on the board and its actual elevation. So there'd be no question about whether a unit was on a hill or not. For example, there's a close-up of a Big Round Top, Little Round Top again, and you can see all the little wee numbers on there indicating the height elevations. So I guess taking a page from the 1958 game, they improved on that. So the terrain was now interpreted to a much greater degree. Now, one odd thing about this game was that with all the work that had gone into including a topographical map of the actual battle, terrain didn't matter a lot in this game. And you might say, well, why? Well, they took the view that the hills around Gettysburg are all rolling, and the terrain was not a real impediment to movement. Not when you consider that each turn actually represented 1 hour. Now, the game had some of the best strategic road rules I'd seen in a game in a long time. You may remember that in the 1958 version of the game, the units just crawled across the map. I mean, 2 squares per turn. It would take hours for Heath to march from the edge of the board there up at the Chambersburg Pike to Gettysburg, which of course is completely ahistorical. But in this game, they improved the road system greatly, and I'll explain how. Okay, for example, let's say we had Heath's division coming in on the Cashtown Pike. as he did historically. And let's say it was 7 o'clock in the morning. In the old game of Gettysburg, the units would crawl forward going 1 or 2 hexes each hour, which made no sense. But in the new version, the strategic movement on roads was much more liberal. In fact, a brigade or a counter could move up to like 25 hexes on a road. This meant a lot more. Because, well, in a single turn, Heath's division could march from the edge of the board there to the town of Gettysburg in one single turn, unless he was blocked. So taking the long view again, you can see those 4 brigades in the upper left. In a single turn, all 4 of those brigades could easily march to the town of Gettysburg in a single turn. So that meant blocking the road with units like Devon or Gamble now made a difference. One heck of a difference, in fact, because the rules stated that you couldn't use strategic movement and, of course, go through enemy units. So if Heath's division did march from the edge of the board, he would have to stop in front of Devon and Gamble, thus recreating the actual incident where Devon and Gamble did block the road. Now, unfortunately, the unit counters for the intermediate game weren't really great looking either, but they did try something new, which I thought was kind of neat. For the Confederates, they actually put a symbol of the state that the unit came from. So it looked peculiar, but after a while the Confederate Army began to take on its kind of national identity. You can see Pettigrew's brigade there, North Carolinians, and there's Georgians there in the upper left. So it was kind of neat for the Confederates, giving it kind of their national characteristics. On the other hand, the Union Army was organized as Hooker arranged them with their special corps badges. So for example, the 1st Corps there uses the little circles, and the 11th Corps had the little half moons. The color of the counter indicating which division. So you had the red division, which I think was the 1st, and the blue division, the 2nd, so and so. The artillery were arranged into battalions. There we have a battalion of Wainwright, which would represent all the corps artillery for the 1st Corps. The Confederates were arranged also in battalions. So there we have Pegram's battalion representing about 5 batteries there. So it was on the brigade level, this game. You might ask, how did the game play? Well, it actually played pretty good. And Avalon Hill had some innovative rules that kind of simulated Civil War combat. They made some improvements on the basic combat system that other games were using, and tried to close some of the little crazy loopholes that existed in combat. And I'll give you an example of that here in a moment. For example, in a lot of regular combat games, you could just move this brigade around, completely outflank the guy, and hit him, you know, from the side. And you might say, well, wait a minute, what's that little brigade doing on the right while these guys are doing that? Wouldn't he move? Well, yeah, he would. So let's see how Avalon Hill kind of fixed up that little problem. Well, what they did was, as a unit moved, if it moved within 2 hexes of the enemy unit, try to think of the other enemy unit like a little magnet, the unit was kind of sucked in and had to attack it that way. So as you moved in, you were attracted to the units, and thus you kind of simulated a more linear combat. Now, it still was possible to outflank a guy. Let's say you had a fellow way over here on the left. He could sort of move around this way and get into the rear, which is quite legitimate. But as he moved within 2 of the enemy, he was attracted in, which was a little bit more realistic and made the game a bit more linear. So for its time, yeah, that was a kind of a neat rule for its time. Now the game overall was pretty good at simulating the Battle of Gettysburg. The terrain mattered enough that you kind of had your lines conform to the historic places like Cemetery Hill and Seminary Ridge. So there was a point to going on the high ground and dominating it. So in that sense, the game worked pretty well. you could get historical results and explore alternatives. So overall, I would say the intermediate level game was pretty good. But for reasons I'll get into, the game never really became a smash hit. I don't know if it was a commercial success for Avalon Hill, but I think having the 3 versions of the game in one box hurt the game considerably. And we'll take a look at the advanced game, and I'll try to explain why. Now, I don't mind saying that the advanced version of Gettysburg was a nightmare to play. I think when Avalon Hill designed the advanced version of the game, they had SPI's game Terrible Swift Sword on their mind. Terrible Swift Sword was a very popular Gettysburg game at the time. It came out in 1976. And each counter represented one single regiment and one single battery. Now, as I've shown in intermediate Gettysburg, the counters on this game were brigade level, which I thought was the proper level to simulate the Battle of Gettysburg. But what they did with the advanced version was they used the brigade counters from the intermediate game, but then they added these counters, which I'm going to try to zoom in on. Now, since I have an unpunched copy of the advanced game, I don't really want to punch it out, but the idea was that you would put those little battle line counters underneath the brigade counters and on each flank, and extend and bend your line to conform to the terrain. Like I said, it was a neat idea, and no other game had done that before. But the game had tons and tons of complicated charts. There was your combat fire table, a combat assault table, a casualties table, an artillery firing table, of course, again, battery level. So this was not a simple game. It took a long time to play it. In fact, I don't think I ever completed one single game of the advanced game. Now, the copy you're seeing here is not the copy I had back in '77. This is one I got since then. That's why the advanced version is unpunched. But the advanced version was just impractical to play in 2 hours. It could not be played in 2 hours. So it never really caught on, in my opinion. I don't know what else to say about Gettysburg '77, except that it's not a rare game. You can get copies of it on eBay, no problem. It's not rare. It is out of print, of course, because the Avalon Hill Company doesn't exist anymore. But it is by no means a rare game. If you're looking for an intermediate level game, yeah, it would serve. There are many other Gettysburg games out there, so you've got lots to pick from. I don't think it would be my first choice for a game on the Battle of Gettysburg, but for its time, it wasn't bad. It's just that they tried to do too much by having 3 versions of the game in one box. Now, the next game I'm going to review is going to be, I think, Wilderness Campaign by SPI, and we're going to go to a different game system entirely, an operational strategic game, and move away from the Avalon Hill product. So that was Gettysburg '77.